So this is Effen, which is another one of my monstrous manual named sequencer tracks or patches. And what it is a two-track sequencer with some interesting mixable options. So we've got two lanes here, and we can program in whatever sequence we want. We'll see the progress of that sequencer light up. We can also change the length of that sequencer. It can go up to 16 steps or lower than that, obviously. And we can transpose it. I'm going to turn the audio back on for a sec. Actually, I'm going to change the output mode before I do that. So we're hearing sequencer 1 right now. The transposition only occurs at the start of the sequence. It's a little weird when it goes into a couple of the other modes. But the transposition isn't immediate, which allows you to dial in a transposition without it jumping on you and sounding sort of out of tune, which I like. I'm going to turn this back down. And then we have, for each of these sequencers, 4 different playback positions or modes. So they can go forward, they can go reverse. Yellow is reverse here. The color isn't showing up very well, but it will show up when you use this patch. Green is pendulum, forward and backward. And then aqua is random. So each of these tracks can be used in this manner. But the interesting part comes when we look at the ways that they can be mixed. So the first output's called sequencer 1 output, and the second one is called the mix output. And this is where I'll pause, because I'll inevitably get asked, and I'll put it in the description of the patch, and yes, it will also work with MIDI. Sorry, I get tired of being asked that. And even if it didn't, make it work with MIDI. Anyhow. But you can change the mode of playback for each of these independently. And again, that happens at the beginning of a playback. But the second output is called the mix output rather than the sequencer 2 output, and I'll explain that now, I guess. So let's turn on just sequencer 2, or the mix sequencer. So there are 3 different playback modes. Right now we're in the first playback mode, which is a blue or sky playback mode. In the first playback mode, what happens is that there's a mix control, and the mix control mixes between the probability that the output of the mix sequencer will be from sequencer track 1 or sequencer track 2. And we're hearing some rests in there because what happens is at those points let me just adjust this. When the mix control is at 0, we only hear sequencer track 1, which is in random mode right now. So we're hearing just a random selection from those 7 notes. And if we put the mix at 100%, we only hear the second sequencer track. But when we have the mix between the two in blue mode, what will happen is that it will weigh the probability that one or the other sequencer track will play. But because that percentage, while it adds up to 100, there's, right now there's, when the mixer's at 53%, there's a 53% chance that track 2 will play and a 47% chance that track 1 will play. But there's also a chance that neither plays because, there's a chance that both of them fall outside of those odds. So you get these rests sort of randomly sprinkled around in the first mode, which can be kind of nice. So in mode 2, output mode 2, what happens is that the mix output is forced to produce a note that corresponds to the speed of track 1. And so there will sort of always be something produced at the rate of track 1. And I'll talk about, actually right now I'll talk about the fact that there are these clock dividers. And the clock dividers can introduce some interesting aspects to that. So let's turn the rate of the second sequence up. And let's make this regular again. This is going forward now. So what will happen is we'll always hear a note on one of these beats, but we might hear one of the notes in between at an eighth note, essentially, from the second sequencer that's going faster. And sometimes these quarter notes will come from the note bank of the second sequencer rather than the first sequencer. And we can adjust that so that they're sprinkled in a little bit less often. And we can use more exotic times, which creates more sort of chaotic options there. So this is on 4/3 time now. This is on 1/1. So I just turned it back. Actually, this one's moving at halftime now. But, you have these options to sort of introduce some really sort of interesting juxtapositions of time and that sort of thing. Or you can just use them on the same time scale and, have them draw from different sequences, which creates, I can sort of put these both on sequences moving in the same direction. And let me change the time so that everything is back to the same speed. And what we'll hear, the sequences are slightly different lengths, so they're moving at different speeds, or moving through their sequences at these, overlapping amounts. And we'll hear a sequence that is kind of the same but changes a little bit every so often. So even without the sort of weird timekeeping, it's an opportunity to create longer sequences than would be possible from just one or the other sequence. There's a generative element, but there's a consistency there. You can determine how much it sort of passes back and forth between the two sequencers. And then the final mode is sort of a Hocketing mode. And what will happen here, I'm going to bring back in the other voice. I should point out, I didn't point out, this is playing in the internal voice. The other voice is coming from a 2 HP pluck. And what happens here is that it's the same sort of principle as the first output mode, where the mix output determines, whether it plays from that mix sequence or not. But here the difference is that it also affects the sequence 1 output. So what you'll have is two voices that sort of trade off. If one of them is triggered based on the mix position, then the other one isn't. And so you get this sort of Hocketing back and forth call and response thing. So that's just a, like a really, I think, nice way to create a sort of sense of play, say, in a sequence. And that's the basic operation. There's a quantizer for each output. There's also, on this second page, a value module. There's a CV input for clock. There's also a CV input for mix. And you've got an attenuverter here. So you can determine just how much that CV affects the mix. And that's interesting too, because you can obviously do something where you use a clock divider or what have you to control the mix and get some elaborate things going on. If you're not using a CV input for clock, you can do tap tempo. And this is a reset control for the sequences. You have to hold it down until the sequence is reset. But then they'll reset. And there's one other control, which is what I call a trigger extension. So the patch uses triggers. The outputs are triggers in CV. Sometimes MIDI doesn't do great with triggers, or maybe even in the the module that you're using, that you're trying to trigger, the trigger output of the ZOIA trigger is pretty fast. Most trigger accepting modules also have a high refresh rate at their inputs, but If you're having trouble with that, you can use the trigger extension to sort of make the triggers a little bit longer. And that is Effen. I'm going to let it play out a little bit, and then I'll stop recording the video.